Hey guys, how's it going? Ultimate Kahuna here. I'll be doing a live reading of Herverse Chapter 1, a unfinished and unpublished novel by Sybil, one of our very own. Please feel free to share if you can. I'm still live streaming is still kind of new for me, so I'm not sure how to share while I'm live streaming or how to share beforehand, which would have been helpful to learn. Alas, let's get started. When she felt a twinge of magic dancing just at the edge of her senses, Miriam paused mid-sip and set her cup to the table with a soft click. Out of habit, she could never completely abandon. Her mind cleared itself, and she analyzed her surroundings. The tension passed when she heard a polite tapping at her door, prompting her to push her hair back, stand, and move to the fore of her home. She opened it to find a youngish woman in a crisp uniform standing before her. Her black hair reached down to her shoulders in a neat slick, and her cheeks were puffed with a smile. Before Miriam given a moment to ask after the purpose of her visit, the woman said, "My, you're a tall one." Miriam smiled. The gesture was done partially in amusement and partially in exhaustion. Elves were a rare sight, but when their women stood taller than human men, they weren't difficult to recognize. "How may I help you?" The woman reached into a leather pack suspended on her hip by an ornate black brass buckles. She said, "Oh, I'm here on behalf of the Arcanium regarding an application to become an underscholar." "A well-timed visit," Miriam said. "Miriam should be returning soon." She opened the door widely, offering her visitor a view of her home's interior. There was an elegant savagery in the form of each furnishing. Wood, leather, and fur formed the template, and from those colors her home was painted in a brutishly efficient arrangement of space and shape. Where stone was interspersed, it was rough and unhewn, but placed with such deliberateness it seemed a natural part of its surroundings. The woman entered without waiting for a spoken invitation, apparently familiar with elvish customs to some degree. She stopped to remove her boots and made her way to the fire pit and sat beside it. "Thank you. My name is Emmy. I'm an underscholar myself, a courier." Miriam's round almond-shaped eyes shined briefly with curiosity as she wondered how common it was for underscholars to be trained to employ magic. "Here bearing good news, I hope." Emmy smiled. "I'm afraid that information is privileged." The smile was bright with implication, and Miriam felt a rush of relief wash over her, then pride, then anxiety. In his 2 decades of life, her son had never ventured further than 10 leagues from his home. Soon, the world beyond the cottage and the hamlets surrounding it would assume the role of his caretaker. It took effort not to worry at her lip when she pondered the ways the world could fail him or teach him the wrong lessons. But this day was bound to come, and if he had felt ready, then he was ready. Miriam set those thoughts aside for later, then glanced back to Emmy. "Are you hungry? I'm sure it was a long trip." "Not as long as you think," Emmy said, "but I would never turn away hospitality. If I may, it's nice to be away from the campus and around something soft." She patted the furs beneath her, treated to be lush enough to invite sleep beside the fire. Miriam wondered after what life in the heart of the spire might be. That deep within its mountainous bulk, everything would be wrought from obsidian, no sunlight, no wind. "I've heard the life of an underscholar is a challenging one." "It is," Emmy said. relaxing into the fur blanket beneath her with a weary but satisfied sigh. I'm nearly done with it. I almost think I'll miss it in a strange way. Finding a degree of reassurance in that, Miriam stood and made her way to the kitchen. The floor of her home was comprised of oaken planks, and the sound of her steps were dispersed into the cellar beneath them when it wasn't muted by fur rugs. Miriam usually comes home with a hare or two, she said. She wished she'd bring back home 50 of the vermin a day to keep the stuff in a salt barrel. Shaking thoughts of the buck-toothed menace from her mind, Miriam set to preparing something simple and hearty. By applying a touch of her craft, something the world at large had forgotten by now, the bounty of the earth could be coaxed and nurtured to be a little bit more bountiful. The hamlets surrounding her college associated a growing reputation with her produce. She paid well for it, even if she wasn't paid well enough to afford spices. Wild herbs could fill those blanks well enough, and salt could pick up the remainder of the slack. A hunter, then? Emmy asked to fill the quiet. Handy with the placement of a snare, Miriam clarified. He's got a nose for game, gets it from his father. So, Emmy, tell me a bit more about the life of what life as an underscholar is like. Miriam paused her task briefly to serve her guest honeyed mead in a wooden mug, which Emmy gulped gratefully before wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Summer was well on its way. Miriam wondered if the chilled, stony interior of the spire left those who lived it within unaccustomed to the warmth of day. It's one of study and work with very little time for recreation. Early mornings, late nights, and a lot between them. She sighed again, then flexed her toes until the bones popped. Lots of walking, too. Can't complain about the food or the administration. Well, I could, but who would listen? Miriam chuckled, then lit a small fire on her stove and began filling a pot with what time and patience would render into a vegetable stew. One of her long sloped ears twitched towards the front door. She reached up and pushed her pale blue hair behind it, then glanced towards a sound Emmy hadn't noticed. The door opened a moment later, and as her son entered, his eyes shifted immediately to the courier. He'd have picked up on her scent long before reaching the door, no doubt. I wasn't expecting company, he said. As he closed the door, he shifted his shoulders, and a tether from which 2 dead hares hung slipped free. Miriam approached his mother to hand them off, and in passing to look Emmy's way. Good day? Good day, Emmy said. Miriam, I presume. Miriam watched her son as he approached the other side of the fire pit and sat. He wore the pelt of a stag fashioned into a cloak and draped over a soft gray tunic. It contrasted his eyes and hair sharply, both a nearly translucent blue, both inherited from his mother. There was a nervousness in his bearing, but he hid it well. Miriam never strayed far from her property, but in his sparse travels, Miriam had encountered underscholars before. Where Miriam did not initially recognize the uniform, he did. I am, he said. Do you have news for me? I do, Emmy said. She smiled with curiosity in the gesture that Miriam found grating. Have a look. Miriam reached over the fire pit and retrieved the parcel she had been carrying. It was not difficult to smirk in the deliberate slowness with which he opened it, as if he hadn't been burning for the answer to this question for the better part of a year. As he read, his expression shifted a few times, but the combination of faces was unreadable until he deflated with a relieved sigh and slowly folded the letter in his hands. "Well," Miriam said, "don't keep me in suspense." "I did it," he said numbly. With a frown, he added, "I'm disappointed with some of my marks. Some of those questions came from the second and third year exams," Emmy said with a wave of her hand. "You aren't the only one they've stumped." She met his eyes and said, "Speaking Elvish will really open some doors for you." Miriam asked, "How so?" "Not many do," Emmy explained, "and those rarely know it half as well as you. If your application is any indication, with some luck, you'll avoid all the kitchen and dormitory details and spend your hours working in a library." If Miriam knew her son as well as she thought, that would sound less like a task and more like a dream to him. "What comes next?" Miriam asked. "Enrollment," Emmy said. The Arcanum spent the last month notifying all the underscholars. And one more class will be in session. Can you reach the spire from here in a fortnight?" Miriam felt that gnawing sensation in her belly again. Now that she knew for certain that her son would be stepping out in the world to discover new things, she also had to reconcile how empty this cottage would feel in his absence. If he wished to make that deadline, he'd have to leave in less than a week. "Yes," Miriam said. "What shall I bring?" Emmy reached across the fire pit and tugged at his cloak. "Some clothes that don't make you look like a bumpkin." Miriam's back straightened slightly. Miriam muted an amused snort behind her hand. "I'm just cheesing. You can show up with the clothes on your back and that letter of admission. Anything else will be extraneous." As Miriam went about asking his questions, Miriam divided one of the hairs up to add to the stew. In the course of an hour, the three of them were sharing a meal. The elf observed from a distance, but made a mental note of every word said. Miriam was doing his best not to have his questions pour forth, but after a time it became obvious he had more to ask than Emmy had time to answer. Once she was ready to depart, she disengaged politely, thanked Miriam for the meal, and congratulated Miriam on his acceptance. Hold on. Just going to take a second and make sure the stream is actually running. Okay. Oh, sweet. People are actually here. I couldn't see it from the StreamYard for some reason. Hey, guys, thanks for hopping on. I really appreciate it. Anyway, back to the story. Miriam watched with slightly narrowed eyes as she left. Moments after the door closed, she felt that twinge of magic again. If she bothered to peek through the nearby window, she knew Emmy would be nowhere to be seen. "Charming girl," Miriam said. "Perhaps you'll see her again?" She was nearly bowled over when Miriam threw himself into her arms. She was taller than her son by a head and then some, but the energy of his embrace offset the difference. The laughter she kept in check before bubbled free as she embraced him in return, then said, "Well done, my darling son." "I can't believe it," he said shakily. "Ira asked me this morning if I'd heard anything." "Have more faith in yourself," Miriam said. I can scarcely get you to answer to your own name for how deeply you bury that nose in your books. Surely it all counted for something. Surely, Marianne agreed, as he took a step back. She watched her son as he came to a full understanding of what this development meant. It warmed her heart to see a touch of sadness in his eyes when he looked back up at her and said, "This will be goodbye for a few years." "I'll be here when you return," she said. "Your lady friend may not be so patient." "Ira?" he asked. "She flirts, but her mother would never approve." "A shame," Miriam said. "She's so polite." "To you?" Miriam smirked. He looked to the letter again, and Miriam imagined all the things that piece of paper would change moving forward. She asked, "What were you doing all morning?" Miriam slipped the letter back into the envelope and looked back to his mother. "I wanted to make an offering." The room fell quiet. Then Miriam sighed her son's name. There was no helping it, she supposed. The humans had traditions and the elves had theirs, but at times she worried that because he could not look the part of an elf, he played it all the more passionately. Before Miriam's father had passed, she'd never set much time aside to discuss the demi-human tradition, so she had raised him with hers. Humans often found elf beliefs queer, but the one they seemed to find strangest was the deification of the mother. While the worship was not literal, the rites and pageantry were a cornerstone of elvish belief, and her son was a pious one. Something in elvish blood called for faith, the same way his blood would one day begin calling for magic. All right, let's check. Sweet. All right, I figured I'd say hi to the chat here for a minute. Sup, Wrangler, Brian McCoppin, Evele. Man, you guys, thanks for coming out, man. I couldn't even tell anyone was here. Evele. All right, everyone here, I really appreciate you, and you guys all deserve a woo. Woo! That's how it goes, man. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. I'll continue here in just a second. Boom. Very well. He smiled and reached for his journal. Oh, yeah, that was the end of chapter 1. It was shorter than I remembered. Alas, I think it was pretty short. I think I might just read into chapter 2 if anyone wants to stick around. But yeah, this is Her Verse by Sybil, our very own. He is my favorite unpublished author within the Iron Age and within our kind of community that we've built on A Drink with Crazy's channel and in the Gilded. Anyone who's worked with him in editing and or beta reading says he's tremendous, and they're not wrong. Anytime I hand him a manuscript of mine, he makes it better in a very short period of time. Anyway, how are you guys doing tonight? Anyone have any questions? Demon Beavers. Yo, Eric Wag, you joined too. There you go. We got some woos in the chat. Hail the Iron Age and the ultimate Kahuna and his fans. There you go, man. Anyway, you guys want me to continue? Yeah, you know what? Never mind. This is my channel. I do what I like. So let's see. We'll go. There we go. Sorry, I think I took myself off there for a second. Could you guys hear me? Pull the lever, Crunk. Ah, wrong lever. There we go. Yes, Evelyn, absolutely. He's one talented fella. If I had half his writing ability, I'd be very wealthy at this point. Anyway, yeah, no, Brian McCoppin, being this awesome, it takes a lot of work to carry the weight of my kahunas around on this stream. Also, if my relative is still here, I'll leave you anonymous, but I'm sorry if you're hearing all this. Anyway, so back to the Herverse. I'll start chapter 2, and maybe we'll see after that. If anyone has any questions, post them, and I'll get to them as soon as I'm done. All right. Game phase. The mortals above have many theories regarding what lay on the other side of death. The answer was hell, 7 of them to be precise, arranged in descending order of severity, from the searing, torturous circle of wrath to the heaven-like blissful circle of lust and beyond. The souls of the dead and the damned would filter through the rings until they were drawn to their likes. In times of great strife, such as when the mortals waged war, or when natural disasters killed tens of thousands at once, Mina would watch the stars from her window, pinpoints of light, swirling above in a glowing maelstrom that gradually led its fury into the hells above and below. It was one of the few things to distract her from the drudgery of an eternity spent beneath her father's smothering wing. But in mere hours, all of that would change. She paced her room, cloven hooves clicking pensively against polished black stone. Her fleshy tail twitched, and a tiny pair of wings at the small of her back fluttered nervously as she counted down the minutes. Her father was campaigning, and as she milled about and reviewed her escape plan, he was likely waist deep in Opeth's legions, butchering them with abandon and grinning ear to ear. Of the 7 lords of hell, her father wasn't the most powerful, but he was the most patient. He'd waited a long time for this victory. He began putting the pieces in place centuries ago, and in his absence, Mistral bore the yoke of authority. She was never clever and watchful, but she had her vices as well, one of which Mina had already exploited to great effect. Even now, Mistral remained blissfully unaware of the fact that she'd already failed. Mina chewed on her bottom lip and glanced out her window again. Souls continued to filter through fiery skies, the majority of them finding a home within the circle of lust. That was another reason for her father's grip on his title, was anything but tenuous. Of all the sins mortals were prone to, sorry, it's glitching out on me. Lust was only second to greed. Her father's armies were never without volunteers. The sun set. She'd often heard the damned complaining about its size and brightness. Once it dipped beneath the horizon, one of the gold mountains capped with silver snow and wreathed in clouds of powdered amethyst. A warm glow raised up from beyond. The sun would sink beneath a few more skylines before it rose high overhead, shining directly from the circle of wrath and dropping down through the center of each circle. Mina took a deep breath, then picked up a satchel, approached her door, and rested her hand on the knob. Each time her heart thudded in her chest, her entire body tingled in anticipation and dread. It was a simple plan, but if any part of it went wrong, she wouldn't get another chance for centuries, if it ever presented itself again. She twisted the ornate silver knob, then pushed the door open and peered down the hallway. As overbearing as her father was, he hadn't gone as far as to post guards outside of her room yet. So she had an unobstructed view of the long curved hallways that led from her door in either direction like a pair of horns. War trophies were arranged in frames, on stands, and armor racks, or in certain cases trapped alive in prisons of crystal that suspended the animation of their bodies. Her father claimed the trophies to be gifts, but in her mind, it was simply a way to try to impress his favorite daughter. It rarely worked. Having done all the hesitating she could afford to do, Mina darted down the hallway, her satchel clutched to her chest as she ran. When she reached the door at the far end, she pushed it open and kept a brisk pace as she made her way from the wing her father had reserved for her and towards the workshops. Traveling directly from one point to the other would be a fool's errand. The machinery she needed to access was kept under lock and key. Even beneath her father's precious pretty princess wouldn't get her access the honest way. Fortunately, forethought and cleverness made a wonderful substitute for permission. To goat or not the goat? Why do we get, yeah, Brian McCubbin. Why do we even have that lever? And to goat or not to goat? Well, Wrangler, you tell me. Here we go. That's better. Okay, back to the story. As the Lord of Lust, her father's palace was as lavish and decadent as any mortal could dream. But the closer she drew to the workshops, the more industrial her surroundings became. Walls formed of precious metals and inlaid with ornate filigree gave way to Sloan stabs, checked with thick pipes and hissing valves. Doors were heavy and secure now. It took a conscious effort to avoid the dams that flitted about, seeing this and that. But the machines were loud, massive, and gave off glaring light from their innards that in turn cast dark shadows to cover her approach. At one point, she practically stood side to side with the disembodied soul of a young man, humming contentedly as he checked readings and recorded his findings to a tablet of enchanted clay. Mina correctly predicted the man's movement, then slid gracefully to one side to remain in his blind spot. When the damned soul floated among with a cheery hum, Mina stalked quickly in the opposite direction, her goal within sight. When she came within 20 paces of the door, Mina leaned against a large vat of something undefiable, glowing sludge, then sank to her rear and peered around the side. It was a straight shot, but it would take a full minute to open the door. She reached into the pack she carried and withdrew an orange crystal, shaped into a perfect hexagon, but the length of a finger. Her eyes shifted back to the door and the receptacle she'd be slipping the key into. Forging it accurately enough to fool its keeper had been no easy task, and it was time to see if it would pay off. With no one in sight and a fear of hesitation nipping at her heels, Mina ran into the open. The hissing of vapor and grinding of gears masked the sound. When she reached the door, she slid the key into the lock, then stepped back. Your father warned me you might try to run off in his absence. Mina set her jaw and stood unmoving. She wasn't certain where the voice had been projected from, but she knew whom it belonged. Minstrel, her father's most cherished concubine. She was human, or had been at some point. Perhaps mortal souls were easier to impress and enthrall. And for it, Minstrel had developed an almost religious devotion to him. If anyone could come along at the last hour and throw a wrench in Mina's plans, it would be her. Run off? Mina asked innocently. I only wanted to see the observatory. He always keeps it a secret, and I've been curious for a time. A brief flash of light stone over dull orange of molten energy and dense black of greasy smoke. It formed a flat oval like a mirror. Then Minstrel's face appeared to stare back at her in place of her reflection. Don't play dumb, Mina. go back to your room and we can pretend this never happened. Mina didn't look to the projection of Minstrel's face. She stared at the door and at the hexagonal recess where the orange silver of crystal now sat. Mina, Minstrel sighed, look at me. If there was one thing Mina hated most about Minstrel, it was when she presumed to speak to her with a motherly tone. That she was also presumptuous enough to use her true name when addressing her did not help. The succubus turned her gaze to Minstrel's face and stared blankly. Minstrel raised a hand, twirling a length of crystal between her fingers, one identical to the key Mina had attempted to access the observatory with. She said, "There are 3 tinkers in the 7 hells capable of replicating this key. Whatever you did, it will not undo the ward or open those locks." "I know," Mina said. The door jerked slightly, as if some mechanical force had briefly unseated it. Then it began unfolding and receding into its frame as its numerous panels retracted. It was Minstrel's turn to stare blankly. Mina added, "That's why I left the forgery around your neck and kept the real thing." "When? How?" 3 nights ago," Mina said. "And you were sleeping off that soma you love so much." "Goodbye, Minstrel." "Mina, stop!" She swept her hand through the mirror, and it dissipated in a puff of blue smoke. A moment later, the ground lurched beneath her, and the workshop shook as if the hells were preparing to quake beneath her hooves. That would be Minstrel, and Minstrel would not be happy right now. Anyway, damn, here we go. Oh, Wrangler, okay, man. Sorry, I didn't see you were leaving. But God bless you, man. Thank you for coming by. I really appreciate it. There you go. All right, back to the story. Mina retrieved the key, then quickened her pace. The door began resembling itself behind her, but that ward couldn't direct itself fast enough, even when she could feel the distant discharge of spiritual energy as Minstrel rushed towards the observatory like a flood of desperate anger. Her father would hold Minstrel responsible for this, so that desperation was both understandable and warranted. She was sprinting now, hooves beating against steps of smooth stone as she bolted up a winding staircase to the peak of the observatory. All the while, Minstrel's impotent thrashing threatened to sway the ground beneath her and steal her balance. The ward must have erected itself in time. Flail all she liked, Minstrel had no way to follow her. But that didn't mean Mina had time to waste. After what felt like a decade, she made it to the top, and was momentarily taken aback by what she saw. Overhead were mechanical arms, some dainty, some massive, all supporting stone rings of various size. The rings were ornate and numbered in the dozens, stacked neatly against the high ceiling and folded into the walls surrounding her. In the center of all this was the lens, a tool that could see through the fog separating planes and send matter from one to the other. It stood like a squat stone pillar, covered in innumerable dials, gauges, and switches, and levers. It took 10 seconds of trying to match the machine to the drawings she'd seen in the technical manuals she'd pilfered before she found the recess for the key. The more time passed, the more persistent Minstrel's thrashing became. "I know you can hear me, Mina! Get away from that machine!" Mina ignored her. As the lens began to draw power from whatever it found those infernal stores, the mechanical arms above her shook and guttered. 3 of them swept down and rearranged their stone hoops in a row. Energy crackled and sparked along the interior of each ring. "Mina!" She flinched from the severity in Minstrel's command, but this close to her goal, with her freedom so near, Mina would not be deterred. She glanced to the coordinates on display, then reached for one of several identical chrome levers and yanked it and prayed. The rings detached from their arms, grew orange hot, then melded into one another and began to rotate. As the speed increased, so did the clarity of images shining through the other side of the portal. When it stabilized, she pulled the second lever and dove through. The first thing she felt was shock. With the lens aligned properly, the trip between planes was as eventful as walking through a doorway. What she hadn't expected was how different existing in the physical world felt. Gravity was wrong, and when she realized she was falling, the problem was compounded. She spun clumsily in midair, doing her best to train her sight back to the glowing ring that led her here. Half a second later, she spotted it. It blinked out of existence. Good. With the key in the observatory locked inside of it and the gate shut from both sides, her father would have no means to pursue her. With that sorted, she could focus on surviving this fall. Mina spread her arms and legs and fluttered her tiny wings, eventually managing to stabilize and get a better view of her surroundings, rushing up to greet her. Green, as far as the eye could see, with a deep purple sky. Souls were scattered throughout it. Banners of cosmic dust were spun like silk, draped from horizon to horizon. Only one horizon, but it was one of the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. She reached for magic and found it in abundance, raw, thriving, and unspoiled by industry. Drinking enough in to power a cantrip of levitation was easy, but casting it was not. Though they had form and physicality of a sort, the hells were all immaterial planes. For a demon, shaping magic in such a place was as easy as thinking it. In a place like this, a physical world where she possessed a physical body, extra steps were involved, chants, somatic gestures, and expressions of belief and faith. The way mortals used magic was clumsy and inefficient, but it was better than having no magic at all. She fought against the chill of the wind, stuttering through the spell and refining the raw mana moments before disaster. Mina strained. Her descent slowed just below bone-breaking speeds, upon which time she bounced off a hillside and tumbled for 20 or so paces to its base. Not the most graceful escape, but about as dramatic as she'd envisioned. Hey, there you go, man. Welcome, Sybil. Welcome to the party, brother. Had people kind of popping in and out. I was just going to read one chapter, but alas, I forgot how short it was, so back at it. All right, man. Thanks for popping by. And again, I love this story. Anyone who hasn't read it, give it a read for yourself. It's much better than this experience I'm giving you right now. Mina unpacked herself and then retraced her steps to collect her things, take inventory, and form a plan. This is uncharted territory, a wilderness full of superstitious primitives, and there would be dangers. But she was clever enough to ensnare one of them properly. That was to be her first priority. Without a bondmate, her physical form wouldn't sustain itself here long, days at most. Mina finished brushing the dirt from her dress and took stock of her surroundings. The hells had forests as well, but not like this. These strange trees breathed and lived, as did the ground beneath her. Alien sounds drifted to her ears, but it was the air, the smell of it, that surprised her the most. It was as if she'd never drawn a breath before this one. Clean, fragrant, thin, and easy to pull in and release. Or perhaps it was just the scent of freedom, and she'd otherwise be repulsed by the stench. Who could say? What could be said was that she'd done it. There would be time to celebrate, not until she found herself a willing mortal, but she was free. Boom. There we go, man. Thank you everybody who has stuck around so far. But these chapters are just breezing right through. How is it sounding on your guys' end? I hear it in my headphones, but it's not a great representation. Of course, Sybil. I'm humbled to be allowed to read these books on a live stream, especially something that's not released yet, at least not published. You released it on your Substack, and it's tremendous, man. I'm so excited to be allowed to read this for all you fine people. Sup, Eric Wag? Still sticking around, man. Evelyn, how was hockey, man? Not quite sure what the delay is here between the stream on my end and what you guys are seeing. I suppose I could just check. Oh no, you lost? Shoot. Oh, it's all right, man. It happens. All right, so I'll need to talk with a few audio experts and see what I can do differently. I'm not sure if I'm too close to the mic with the volume too high or too far away. I'll need to adjust my audio settings quite a bit. Well, at least you gave it a good shot, man. I really appreciate you stopping by. All right, so how long? I've been at it for 42 minutes. That's not that bad. Oh, just a tad hungover, Evelyn. Anyway, I mean, F it. While I'm here, I'll just give everyone a shout. So we got Eric Wag. He's an Iron Age author, and he has his own YouTube channel. Go check it out. Right on YouTube. So easy to find. It's Eric, E-R-I-K, Wag, W-A-A-G. And then we have Evelay Music. That's E-V-A-L-A-E-I-G-H Music. Evelay Music. He did the intro song for my channel, as well as what was it, the Kikkoman fight song, and a whole host of others, man. It's fantastic. Alas, here we are, man. I'm happy to be doing this. I'm excited to get better at this. I need to adjust my audio settings, obviously, and I need to get better at just public speaking, because that's basically what this is. But I appreciate everyone sticking around. I know everybody has stuff to do. Would you like me to continue, or are you guys happy to stick around for one more chapter? There we go, man. All right, brother. So one more. There we go. All right, Eric Wag. Happy to do it. So try to stay consistent in my distance and volume distance and kind of volume of the mic. Hopefully when I adjust the audio settings, when I do a female voice, it's not too jarring. Obviously, I can only barely hear it, so we'll have to see, but here we go. Her verse, Chapter 3. Miriam had dreamed of other elves before, but none of those dreams had ever felt this real. Though being politely well-spoken had prevented him from making enemies among the villages he frequented, he made a friend or two along the way. All of those friends were human beings. He could share many things with Ira, but he did not worship as she worshipped, and his traditions were not her traditions. Being of inquisitive temperament, he found joy in learning Ira's traditions and sharing his own, but neither could adopt the others. He sometimes dreamed of one day meeting others of his kind. His mother warned him that many would be unwilling to tolerate the presence of a crossbreed, so he kept his expectations low. But this one seems friendly enough. A handsome name, Penelope said, when she'd replaced the fallen books. She, she pressed a hand to her hip and approached. It felt odd to be intimidated by a woman's beauty, and the stranger still to feel an almost instinctive desire to impress her in some way. There were times when he felt the same way towards Ira and wished to be admired by her because he felt affection for her in his heart. This was far more visceral. Thank you. And you for your concern, Penelope replied. Well, now that introductions are in order, I feel it'd be a shame if conversation didn't follow suit. Will you indulge me? Certainly, Marion said. Would you like to sit? She nodded. So he led the way back to the table he'd claimed. Splayed over its surface were numerous volumes, books he'd read so many times that he'd memorized large portions. Poetry, mostly Elvish, collections of songs and plays he'd hoped to see one performed on stage one day. Research? Penelope asked. Of a sort, Marion said as he pulled a chair out for her. She nodded graciously and sat. He felt unsure of the proper distance to keep when sitting beside her, and hoped that he didn't err too much on the side of caution. Tell me of it. I look to my betters for inspiration, Marion said. When I compose a verse, I think of how hundreds of years from now, in the future, how they may interpret it, because proper verses will withstand for hundreds of years. A lyricist, then. A poet, or at least I hope to be recognized as one, Marion said. Before him, numerous parchments with half-finished poems were arranged, some with lines crossed out, others with notes circled or words underlined. Each product of his creativity was dissected with precision and intent, with the hope that future iterations would benefit from the process. Will you share a verse with me? Or would I be presuming upon the artistic process? Marion laughed, and rang through the halls of the library and tumbled along the spines of dusty, neglected almanacs. To him, a verse was not complete until it was perfect, and striving for perfection was what brought him the greatest joy. He prized the incremental but notable improvements earned over countless hours of introspection and study. If she wished to presume on that process, she'd have to be at his side throughout the entirety of it. Not that he found the idea offensive. Her beauty was both delicate and full. From her crown spilled a river of red, framing a round face with a pert nose, full lips, and large maroon eyes. And her scent, warm, subtle, inviting, stirring. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat when a sudden rush of excitement overtook him. Penelope smiled with a glimmer of hopeful expectation, and when their eyes met, he found himself compelled to entertain her. Well, he began uncertainly, I wouldn't be much of a poet if I didn't defer to a lady's curiosity. He shuffled his papers, unaware of a glowing sheaf of light that formed just outside of his vision. He reached for it absently, and it shifted into a scrap of paper as he turned his gaze towards it. I would die before I allowed her to see it, but I wrote this one about a girl. Penelope sat up a bit, and curiosity joined the mix of light in her eyes. Hopefully, she wasn't expecting mastery of form. If I take time and stock of each small thing, that summed together do a season stir, I say the fairest of them all is spring, and the dreariest are those who aren't her. It was rather tame as far as expressions of affection went. One of Miriam's favorite collections was a grouping of explicit love poems submitted anonymously by famed poets. The thought of writing something like that for Ira had passed through his mind once or twice, but he could never bring himself to be so brazen, even if it would never see the light of day. Still, each word and syllable was placed with deliberation and care. It flowed well, And while he couldn't truly say that Penelope looked impressed, at least her smile hadn't faltered. She must be fair, indeed. She is, Marion said. He paused, losing track of his thoughts as a fog overtook them. It blurred his vision, and he felt his pulse quickening. It burned like a fever, but tingled like the shock of a cold. He raised a hand to his head and heard wood dragging along the stone as Penelope stood, then nearly lost her balance. Though the room was still, he felt the pitching of motion in his belly and feared a shift in gravity would pin him to the ceiling. When Marion tried to speak, the words formed a thick lump in his throat or caught on a dry tongue. His vision would briefly clear in short intervals, and during one such moment of clarity, he saw Penelope leap towards him and grab him by the wrist. She gripped tightly, and when he felt something begin to pull her away from him, he reached for her with his other hand out of instinct. The shelves on the wall behind her began to swirl like water circling a drain, then fell in on themselves to give passage to a strange void, filled with innumerable interconnected stars. Marion! His grip remained firm, but the force grew strong enough to drag him along with her. They were sucked into that void, and as they tumbled, Penelope climbed him until she'd managed to pull him fully into her embrace and clamp her legs around his body. Whatever they were passing through felt thick, like water. When it left him with an impulse to kick his legs, he nearly panicked when he realized her embrace prevented it. That invisible force seized upon Penelope again, violently this time, but her grip remained as firm as his. He heard her whispering under her breath and could scarcely believe what came to his ears. Poetry of some kind, he was sure of it, but in a language he didn't understand and had never heard. Whatever had taken a hold of her was pulling them through the surrounding constellation of dreams with an anger he could feel. And as Penelope's grip began to weaken, he did his best to maintain his. She asked him, "Will you save me?" "How?" "By saying yes?" "Yeah." She kissed him, whispered something timeless and arcane into his mouth, and he woke. Let's see. Yeah, Evelyn, maybe we can chat sometime about it. Not about little less than halfway done with this chapter, but yeah. Let me actually you're on this, so I can just show you. I have a sound box here, but I haven't quite managed to figure out all the settings. I'm able to adjust it here and there, but I'm not quite sure what it means. Sweet. People are still here. Yeah, no, I'd love to chat about it sometime. I'm very new to this whole audio setup. It doesn't help that by my nature, I'm a very mobile person, so I'm always like, anyway. Also, Sybil, I mentioned it early on in the stream, but I'm not going to even attempt to do a Hungarian accent for the demon characters. I'm sorry, my friend. It's just not quite within my skill set. I'd make her sound like she had a mental disability instead of sounding like a foreigner. All right, back to it. Do it in Indian? Marion! I'm sorry, he said. I think the wine took me by surprise. It's no excuse. Oh yeah, I should have had him do it. And no, I'm not going to do Indian. It's going to offend everybody, including it's offending me, and I'm not Indian. Or did you mean like Native American Indian? That they asked me if I could speak Native American. I looked to them and said, "But how?" Holy shoot. All right, Focus. Focus. We need, you know what? We need a goat reset. All right. All right, back to it. Let's see. Adjust this a little bit. Oh, shoot! That should be better. All right. I think I figured out what setting was not working on my sound box. Shoot. Oh well, this should help. When Miriam opened his eyes, sluggishness was thicker in his veins than blood. He raised his head and looked to his window, making note of a queer but familiar scent nearby. Sunlight poured through in concerning abundance, and his mind immediately flashed to all of the chores he'd neglected as he overslept. In celebration, his mother had shared wine with him for the first time. A bit more potent than watered-down mead, and it likely explained the strange dreams he could barely recall. He raised a hand to his face, where the elf from his dreams had kissed him. If it weren't for the terrifying void collapsing in around them, he'd be disappointed the dream had come to an end. Miriam? He flinched in surprise, noticing his mother. She stood in the corner of the room, and the smell of blood was on her. The smell of fried rabbit meat meant breakfast and explained the butchery, but her expression had him wondering if she had murdered a solicitor and buried him beneath the cellar. Shame burned in his cheeks, and he lowered his head. I'm sorry, he said. I think the wine took me by surprise. It's no excuse. Her eyes fell on him, and her features softened slightly. But indirect fury still blazed beneath the blue. She said, You need rest. It wasn't responsible for me to let you do that deep in your cups. I boiled some water and set aside some medicines aside in the kitchen. Drink and take it all, or you'll have a splitting headache if you don't already. In his groggy state, Miriam could barely make sense of her words. But if she was offering leniency, he did not hesitate to take it. He nodded. I have to go to the market. I believe we'll have what I need at Van Sitt's retreat. I want you resting while I'm gone. Understand? Yes, he said. He could recall once or twice in his life when his mother had left her cottage to tend to business with humans. Some mistrusted her. Others looked down on her, and others still judged elves for their distant past as a slave class. The hate was not outward or widespread, but it did exist. If it can wait a few hours, I'm sure I'll be well enough to go all myself. You may not keep your guts in for the rest of the day, Miriam sighed. You've got your father's good looks, but you seem to have inherited my liver. Miriam eased out of bed and made his way towards the kitchen. When he glanced towards his mother again, she wasn't looking at him. She watched the corner of his room, where for a moment he thought he saw the light bending just so, but attributed it to his befuddled state. He saw the muscles in her jaw tense. Then she turned to him and said, I've drawn you a bath. I apologize if it seems I am doting, but you were feverish this morning, and I want you in good health for your wagon ride to the spire. It's fine, he said, and better to learn in the privacy of my home that wine makes me into a fool rather than learn among peers, I suppose. Be safe. Miriam drew him into a hug and said, I'll have you write in short order. Dream up another poem for me. The last was beautiful. He looked away, occasionally meek in the face of her praise, then headed for his bath. The water was pleasantly warm, but wouldn't remain that way for long, so he was quick about it. Once he felt refreshed, he shook himself dry, combed his hair, and dressed. Throughout each action, he felt as if his limbs were moving half a second behind his thoughts, and at times, a sudden lightheadedness would take him. It progressed to the point where he had to steady himself on walls and furniture. Once it had gotten that bad, he gave up on the idea of being productive. Fortunately, His mother hadn't been wrong about whether or not he'd keep his guts in, and he was able to stomach some of the hair she'd prepared, along with all of the medicine and water. Once he returned to his room, when he returned to his room, one careful, plodding step at a time, that oddly familiar scent came to him again. He sat on his bed, where he moved to lay down. He realized it was thickest here. Even after he'd bathed it, it lingered on him faintly. Though he had had the desire to puzzle out its origin, he lacked the energy. The room began to spin slightly, and when he shut his eyes, he could feel movement that he couldn't see. Knowing that sleep would do its best to elude him, he instead thought of the Arcanium and what life would be like. Difficult. Part of him feared that. Life here with his mother was anything but. At the same time, she'd warned him that he'd be slow to mature. The crossbreed offspring of elves inherited their unending lifespan, but they also inherited the restlessness of their mortal parent. His mother once confessed a fear to him that he would wish to travel and see the world before he was ready. Perhaps that was a fair fear, but if it was, his fear of being a milksop poet that wasted the gift of immortality away squatting beneath his mother's roof was also fair. There we go. There we go. All right. Life away from his cottage was a frightening prospect, but it could help him mature, make him more worldly, less like the bumpkin Emmy had seen when she looked on his simple clothes. He had returned, experienced, and learned, with new knowledge to share. Secure in that, he shifted slightly for a couple of hours, and at some point, succumbed once again to sleep. When he woke to the sound of crickets and the absence of sunlight, he immediately felt guilt for sleeping an entire day away and getting nothing done. The sense of smoked fish and Ira came to him. When he made his way into the living room, he found his mother building a small fire. A hen strutted about, occasionally pecking at the floorboards or sending her cockeyed gaze his way. That was a bit of a shock. Hens were expensive, and game was free, but he supposed fresh eggs may have justified the cost. Ira came to visit while you were resting, Miriam said. Were your dreams pleasant ones? She asked all the questions as if forcing herself to sound natural. Miriam thought back and said, I can't recall any. His mother relaxed, then smacked lightly at the back of his hand when he reached for the fish Ira had left as an offering. In a moment, Miriam said. There's something we must do. Sit. He did as bid. His mother crossed the room to fetch the hen and a knife, one he had never seen before. His mother took excellent care of all of her tools, but they were plain and sturdy. This looked ceremonial, curved wickedly into a slender, pointed spike. Smooth gems were set in its hilt, and despite the artistry and craftsmanship, it looked like any wound inflicted with it would cause pain for the sake of it. He found it ugly. My son, Miriam said as she strode to the other side of the smoldering coals. Ira was not the only visitor we received today. Another courier? No. She eased down to her knees and placed the chicken before her. With a flick of her wrist, aligned the edge of the dagger with its neck. Butchering animals wasn't anything shocking to Miriam, but something about this situation set him ill at ease. She looked above his head and narrowed her eyes. Poetry sang from her lips, and he nearly leapt backwards when a faint blue light swept along the edge of the dagger, then doubled its length to form a glowing enchanted blade. The light formed complex patterns, infinitesimal cogs that meshed their teeth to give shape to magic. Something that may have well been a myth for how lost it was to time and how few could practice it, and his mother called upon it with ease. For that purpose, for what purpose, he could not determine. Now, Miriam said, I know you can hear me. I felt your eyes on my back each time I turned it. I can hear your hooves scuffing my floors. She narrowed her eyes, and Miriam stood uncertainly and backed away. Mother, what are you saying? Sit. He sat, and she touched the glowing blade to the hen's feathers. A hen may seem an unassuming catalyst, but this creature's blood will reveal you, painfully, if I spill it. This is your last chance. He heard nothing at first, but flinched when something scraped against the floor behind him. A rat? A specter? If magic was truly real, perhaps ghosts were as well. He stared at his mother in numb fascination as her eyes formed a hard line, and she said, So be it. A split second later, before she decapitated the poor hen, a flash of light and a muffled pop made the atmosphere grow dense. He could feel the grainy tinge of air impregnated with potential energy, and that nagging scent he'd been following all day nearly overwhelmed him with its fragrance. His back snapped straight, blood freezing in his veins as his breath quickened into a series of short gasps. Miriam, come to me. He stood, terrified to look over his shoulder, then stepped over the fire pit. The hen flapped her wings indignantly and flew a short distance off. As he watched the fowl cross the room, he caught sight of their visitor in the corner of his eye. Hackles raised and teeth bared, he eyed the invader with instinctive fear. True to his mother's word, she had cloven hooves, onyx black, and reflective of the dim light of his home's common room. A tail and small pair of wings were attached where her back narrowed. Though her countenance was beautiful, it was also unmistakably demonic. A pair of horns swept back from her brow, and her pupils were slitted in a sea of dark maroon. She had familiar, soft-looking lips and a pert nose, but it was the aura surrounding her that transfixed him. It glowed like fluttering skylights that sometimes appeared in winter, undulating, alternating waves of color that crackled and danced through the stars. The aura faded, and the demon looked down at her hooves. Please, she said. I mean no harm. And now I've nowhere else to go. All right, my friends. That is the end of chapter 3 of Sybil's The Herverse. Now, while I may not have done some of these characters justice or some of these scenes, this is a tremendous book, and we all need to bully him until he publishes it. I'm a little bit sick still, so my voice is fading a little bit, but how was that last bit? There we go. Well, I hope it went better. Did the audio sound better in that last portion or no? I had forgotten to turn on one of the settings on my sound box. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. Let me see if I can share this picture here a little bit. Shift +8. have to figure out how to do that. Anyway. Anyway, I'll have to mess around with the audio settings quite a bit, but any other questions? I really appreciate you guys stopping by, but my voice is fading and I have a lot of stuff to do tonight. So any questions before I get going? Yo, John Burnnuke. Probably butchered that name, man, but I appreciate you stopping by. Sweet. Eric Wegg, hail and good night to you as well, sir. I really appreciate you stopping by. Let's do something a little more fun. Thank you for joining the stream. Next time on the Ultimate Kahuna. Oh, what's my t-shirt? My t-shirt is one I found on Etsy a while back, and it's from the seven deadly sins. It's for the sin of pride, the lion sin of pride. Escanor, who decided that? It's one of his more famous lines from the show, and easily my favorite character from that show. Thanks for asking, Evelyn. All right, guys. With that, I appreciate everybody stopping by. I really, really, really appreciate it. And that's it. Signing off. Woo!